All right, my name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Tyson Crowley. We're at Crowley Wines. It's November 26, 2019. Thanks so much for joining us today, Tyson. We appreciate this. First question, most important question, why wine?
Why wine? Well, I think a lot of people would probably say that wine found them. I definitely would. I was working while I was in college studying operations management, so I was inclined toward a production, a manufacturing setting. I'm not sure why. I think I have like a little engineering kind of bent, and so I was really attracted to manufacturing. Mm-hmm. I grew up in upstate New York. My grandfather had a dairy business called Crowley Foods, and so I was kind of around that all the time. And I think I just was geared toward manufacturing of some sort. Mm-hmm. Along the way, I didn't know what I would actually, I would apply that. Mm-hmm. We were doing various field trips in college to manufacturing settings, mm-hmm. and then I like the idea, like the concept of efficiency and how things work, and so, and kind of the nuts and bolts of manufacturing was cool to me. So as a setting, I was just naturally inclined that way. And then I went and visited upstate New York wine region, and I was just it was the lightning bolt. And I was like, this is it, I like this. And it had to do with the sensory aspect of being in a winery, kind of like everybody. You go into a winery and you're immediately taken by the smells and the sights, and having no background in wine at all, it was really about that. It was just being in the kind of the right place, right time, and I was still pretty young. I was 19, so I wasn't able to like get right to it, but I was in operations management, so I wasn't really studying wine per se at all. Mm-hmm. And so I moved to Seattle, and upon graduation, and kind of held on to that idea that I might try wine, and so it was starting to percolate a little bit. And then I went into project management first. I thought I might work for the Port of Seattle, and ended up pursuing that. It kind of dead-ended a little bit, and from there I just set my sights on wine, and I started visiting the wineries around Seattle, Saint Michel, mm-hmm. Columbia, Bainbridge Island Winery, mm-hmm. and I started bringing wine home to drink. So I was getting myself inclined toward wine as a culture, really. Mm-hmm. How people bring it home, cook. So this kind of like culture of wine was like, for me, a brand new thing, because I wasn't brought up in that. I wasn't brought up in the cook with wine and eat and food. So I was really discovering this all by myself, and having friends involved, and then getting kind of caught up in the romance, I think, of just like wine. Mm-hmm. Bringing it home, you kind of sense the excitement. It wasn't great wine at the time, but it didn't matter. It was like the ritual: shop, bring wine home. And it started to kind of just soak in, and I just started to enjoy it. I enjoyed the food part too, and so I was kind of building my own enculturation, I guess, from scratch. Mm-hmm. And combined with that, I had this sort of vague idea that I would pursue wine as a career. Mm-hmm. So I kind of locked in on that concept, and then once I decided I wasn't going to work for the Port of Seattle, I started calling wineries in Oregon. Mm-hmm. And at that time, it was 1994, and there were only probably 100 total. Mm-hmm. Well, maybe 120. But I just started at the top of the list and started calling down through it was the back page of the Oregon Wine Press. Mm-hmm. All the wineries were there, all the phone numbers were there. and it was old school. I just picked up the phone, and a few people called me back. I remember distinctly Cameron called me back, which was great because I worked for Cameron eventually, and he didn't call anybody back. So the messages would pile up, and I knew he didn't call many people back, so he was just busy. But I remember distinctly him calling me back, leaving me a message, and it was just funny. But years later, I ended up working for him. But eventually, I got a lead to work for Erath, and I was told that it would be a hospitality job first, and with potential to work in production. So I came down, I interviewed, and it just so happened Rob Stewart, I don't know if you've interviewed him yet, he's amazing. And we became kind of just sort of buds, and it was kind of meant to be. He was new there, I was ready to roll and get into this wine thing, and he said sure, and he's from upstate New York too, so we kind of had a little connection. And anyway, I ended up there and worked 7 vintages there, and my first 2 weeks were a little like, oh my God, what did I do? Because I'd moved from Seattle down to rural, I'd lived in Portland, but I was driving out to Dundee every day. So my life was totally different, but and at first it was a little nerve-wracking, but then as I got into the work and I got into the contact with the wine, and it was just kind of magical. It was probably 2 weeks, and I was hooked. And I liked the physicality. I liked the atmosphere, especially at Erath at the time. The setting was just really neat. So I was pretty fortunate, really. I think I made the steps and I took the steps, but I felt like I landed in a good situation, and so once I kind of got used to it, I was really happy, and I could sense the Oregon wine industry was something cool to be a part of. And I was lucky to work with a pioneer. I ended up I didn't realize it all at the time, but after the fact, I was really fortunate to end up with in that situation at Erath. He was old school. The winery ran like a small winery, but it was big. So it was very hands-on, very very hard work. But I think the wine industry kind of sorts people out by that. I think I've seen a lot of people try it, a lot of people get in and then get out, and that's the kind of place that really tests you, and if you can get through a harvest or two and keep trucking, chances are the wine thing is for you, because that was kind of hard yards. So, but it was fun, and we had a good community there. We had great people. It was really fun to run the cellar. We also had a lot of great fruit. So I think for me, it was a great place to get to learn about terroir. And as you look back, you're thinking, what are the great terroirs in Oregon? And Dundee is definitely up there, if not the best terroir. It's a matter of opinion, but we worked with every great vineyard in that off Warden Hill Road. We had every vineyard in that building, and so it was a great place to get in touch with the nuances of place and the way the wines were made. Each of the vineyards had its own expression, and so that's how I came to know. That's how I came to the kind of how I make wine now is, terroir and this commitment to place having a voice in the wines. And that was all really just through working there. And I'd sort of always gravitated toward that after the fact, but I was really appreciative of my time there. There was so much I learned. Even though I got to be honest, I didn't know I was learning all of it at the time. It was just, getting through it and working hard, but I was getting an education too. So and I just ended up being happy with the lifestyle. I met a lot of great people, still great friends that I have today. All came through Erath. So it's a great place to land, and I feel lucky to have done that. But I mean, I started drinking wine too. I started sort of soaking in the actual wine itself in a way that I never had before. And so I think in training for making wine, especially in a given terroir, you have to absorb what's going on through the glass. The experience of learning what's going on in a place. And so I was really doing that too, and I really felt hard for Pinot Noir, and I felt lucky to be in Oregon, because Pinot Noir is such a noble varietal and so expressive, and it really resonates for me. So there was a strong connection to that building too. So I was learning the trade, but I was also developing a really strong connection to the wine and understanding the magic behind wine, and so it was a great place to start out. 7 vintages was a good run too. So.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
So when you're in Seattle and you decided the wine was what you wanted to do, why Oregon? Why were you looking at the Oregon Wine Press specifically and planning to move down here rather than staying in Washington?
I had a good friend living in Portland, and she was an important person to me. So I ended up visiting her a lot, and we were good friends. And so I was spending time here anyway. I didn't realize I didn't feel like Eastern Washington was for me, and the growing region up around Seattle was virtually nil. I mean, they had a few vineyards out on the islands, but mainly there it was manufacturing. Big facilities, Columbia, San Michel. I think there's more micro stuff happening now, but for me at the time, I didn't have a sense for a growing region. And so once I came down to Portland and started visiting on the weekends and going to the valley and visiting wineries and stuff, all of a sudden I had a sense for the actual where the growing was happening. And I think that was ultimately what kind of sort of charmed me, was the growing area. And so it was just that. It was really just visiting, and I didn't really want to live in Seattle. I was kind of sort of done with that. 2 years, and I thought Portland was pretty cool. I like provincial parts of Portland. It's not quite as grandiose, but I like Portland. It fit. So the move was good, and then the wine street was a good fit too. And mainly it was growing region though. I didn't really even know about Walla Walla and all that. I came to understand that a little bit later.
So I'm curious, you had this sort of kind of idea about making wine from New York, from visiting wineries.
Yeah.
I'm curious, when it came to actually working in the cellar, when it came to actually working at Erath, how were your preconceptions? Was making wine what you thought it was? What was different about it? What excited you about it?
There was a lot to chew on there for a production. So like for a person that's into, the steps it takes to get something made. There was a lot going on there, and it was pretty fun for a young 20-something guy, jumping in and driving forklift and running pumps and filters and bottling lines. Like, it was pretty fun, pretty engaging. I think that part of it was appealing to me. And somewhere in there was this product, and it's a very refined product. And so I really liked the idea that you were in this nurturing mode of this fine product, even though the work itself was kind of rugged and dirty. And yeah, I mean, it was dirty and rough, it was tiring. But in the middle of that was this amazing product. And so it was like you're kind of nurturing it through all these stages, and and cleaning was a big piece of it, and I didn't really realize that. But once you get going on it, you're kind of like, it's sort of not unlike cooking in a kitchen, but it's just bigger scale, and a lot of it's preparation and cleaning and then execution, and the better you execute, the better the product. And I think that appealed to me, this idea that you can kind of constantly improve process, and that would end up influencing the product. And so it hit on so many levels. Aesthetically, there was a lot to that was appealing. The scientific part of it, I was also picking up on, able to work in the lab and starting to understand these concepts, the basic concepts around wine that are scientific, and the chemistry, and that was engaging too. So I understand why people get into wine. Like, a lot of people from various backgrounds get into wine because it appeals to a lot of parts, I think, of a person. And I think I was just sort of realizing that along the way, and it was appealing in so many, on these various levels, and to this day, I mean, in a winery, I love being around a winery, so it doesn't get old. Like, I just love the process and the product. But I'd say the shocking part probably was the amount of work. Just how physical. And I think that was partly that environment. It was big, and
but also hands-on, like you said.
Super hands-on. And now I look back, I go, well, there's easier ways to probably do all that. But we didn't have the benefits of, I think Dick, because he was a pioneer, he had sort of evolved to make do with what he had, even as the scale was growing. So everything was a little undersized, everything was a little old, and so it made the process very deliberate and sensual and hard. But as I said, I think that's all the people that I know that are still in the wine business that ever went through that setting at Erath, like J.K. Carrier. Jim's a great friend, and we all look back finally on it. It kicked our butts, and we made no money. But we were all so much better for it in the long run, as sort of wine people. And yeah, it was cool. It was, and we had a lot of interns that came there. We had a lot of Kiwis and Australians and French, and we had people from all over. And they loved it too. They came there and they were just happy as clams to be working in that cellar, and they didn't care. So there was something kind of soulful about it, even though it was gritty. And I think in the long run, if you can make it through that experience as a wine individual, you're better for it. And the exposure to Dick was cool. Getting a sense for a pioneer's story and their process, and there's a lot of nuances there actually, because the wine industry during the 90s was changing a lot. And Dick was his sort of generation the pioneers were dealing with these new sort of inputs, you know, warmer vintages, a lot of press, scores, you know, things that were going on that they weren't quite like wired for all that. You know, Dick he made a lot of wine. He had to make sure he sold it, and so that time presented a lot of new variables to the pioneers, and I think they all had to sort out, okay, what are we doing now? So it was interesting to see him navigate those sort of influences. I think with all the great fruit that we had in that building, and the prices were starting to creep up and stuff like that, I think there was a temptation to go more luxury. And I think Dick had to go through the soul searching of like, what are we doing? What are we about? And because you had new influences suddenly, and new brands, and new kind of identities. It was changing, you know, the tenor of Oregon was changing, and he could see him kind of working his way through that. And he had, you know, people around him that were influencing him and talking to him and trying to help him shape the brand. And I think he went through his own process of what are we, and how much do I want to change? How much, you know? So it was kind of cool watching him navigate a changing industry. And I understand that more now because I have a brand. And, you know, it does change fast, and things come up, and movements take hold, and fads happen, and pricing changes, and, you know, stuff's always evolving. And as I look back now, I thought, man, you know, Dick went through a lot of different stages because he started from pretty much day one. So to internalize the pioneers kind of process a little bit was cool. So that was another kind of like cool like thing that I got out of that too. So.
You landed in a pretty great spot there.
I think so. And people ask me like, what would you recommend if I wanted to get in the industry? I say work for a big winery. You know, just go get your butt kicked and figure it out. I think there's something just great about that. I think part of it is it shows you what's really kind of going on. You know, I think if you take a job here, a job there, you work a harvest here, small winery, you go to another small winery, maybe go Southern Hemisphere, come back, and then you feel like you got it figured out. I kind of don't think that's true. I think hanging in one place through multiple vintages, seeing the cycle multiple times is really good for a person. Understanding how the wine begins, how it ends, what's going on in the middle, and then do another vintage that's maybe completely different. And you know, there's a lot of variables that go with vintages, you know, and so it's not even enough really to do one vintage somewhere. I think you gotta maybe do like 2 or 3 or 4. And then you're really starting to understand like the wine thing. Especially if you can get access to the sales end of stuff, which you don't always get at a big place. You're kind of buffered from a lot of that. But I'd say even from the production end of it, you can learn a lot just by sticking around and going through it. Yeah.
Sure.
So.
You mentioned being attracted to the Oregon industry kind of from the beginning, and also talking about all the changes it was going through. So tell me about your initial impressions of Oregon wine. What was the industry when you got into it? What did you think of it? What were the changes that were happening that you were obviously growing, obviously more press? How was the industry responding to that and dealing with it?
I mean, my impressions of the wines at that time, it was the mid-90s, and the wines were incredibly delicate. We were getting rainy vintages, and the wines were light and expressive and fun, and the way they were made at Erath was it kind of played into that. So I was really attracted to the product, kind of hands down. You know, I'd sort of just, I loved the wines at the time, you know, and then, you know, these wet, coolish vintages turned into warmer vintages. We had the 94, which is pretty, kind of one of the first maybe sort of dark vintages, and it started to kind of get more press. And I just remember, I don't have all the nuances of like how scores and things came to be in the industry, but I remember all of a sudden it felt like hype was building. You know, we had this archery summit and Drouin and Ken Wright and a different wave of producers that all of a sudden were sort of a little more in the spotlight, you know. And I do think that we started getting, with the warmer vintages, certain accolades were building for the industry, and it was just all kind of happening at once. And I think the media attention was shifting a little bit. Like I said, I don't know all the details there because I was pretty busy, but I remember it sort of working around, like you could kind of feel it around the industry, the way things were changing. There was the pioneers were kind of being kind of pushed out of the scene just a little bit, you know, and the new wave of producers, the Penner-Ash, the Ken Wright, even John Paul, and the like they were the rock stars of that moment, and so there was that dynamic shift that was kind of going on, and I do think that there was also more emphasis on quality of the manufacturing. You know, there was this idea that we can take the wines to a new place, and it would take a little more investment. It would take nicer equipment, nicer buildings, nicer, you know what I mean? Like all of a sudden it was like, okay, this kind of groovy rustic Oregon thing was like kind of quaint, but it was like, now it's time to take this up a few levels, and I think that was a good thing. You know, I think at that time it was kind of what was needed. You know, this idea that, you know, we can do better. I think we all after the pioneers have the benefit of the infrastructure is already sort of there, so we can do the refinement. Whereas I don't think the pioneers always had that option. You know, they were sort of planting grapes, you know, building a winery, selling into a market that didn't know anything about Oregon. So they had a lot of other things on their plate, and I think one of the themes was that, you know, the wineries were kind of scrappy and a little bit, you know, not everybody had a winemaker and an assistant winemaker and a cellar hand, you know, a cellar master. It was like still the bootstrapping kind of mentality. And now all of a sudden we were getting this professional kind of like, okay, now there's a winemaker, there's an assistant winemaker, there's cellar master, new barrels, good equipment, you know, things like that. Gravity flow wineries. And then you have like Drouin, who came on to the scene and brought this kind of mystique and validation, and yet they had a beautiful building. So it's kind of like, I think we were just sort of going into this mode of how do we make this better now, and, you know, and I think that was. It was another kind of new expansion, a new place that Oregon was going. And with that came a good amount of press and attention and attention, you know, in a good way, you know, kind of like it was another kind of quantum leap for the industry. But I think that transition between the 80s and 90s and early 2000s was kind of a little tricky. Like I always heard from everybody at ERATH that the 80s were hard for the Oregon wine industry. Volumes were building, but the demand was still almost always short of that. So it was I think hard. And I think I wasn't there, but I kind of had this sense there was like a little sort of lull, late 80s, early 90s of like, okay, what are we doing? Now we've figured certain things out, but now what? And then all of a sudden it like kicked in again in the late 90s. I think we had this whole new sort of identity and in a sense a purpose that was just clear.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it was interesting to be a part of that.
I can imagine. So 7 vintages at ERATH. Tell me what happens next for you. Where did you go from there?
So I went from there to, I was kind of getting a sense I might want to make wine, but I was still not like quite ready. And so I spent 2002, I went to New Zealand, came back, and then I worked 2002 harvest for my buddy Jim, J.K. Carrier. He was just down the street here. And I was sort of in transition. I wasn't totally sure what my next step was as far as where I wanted to work. I ended up there in Brickhouse and Brickhouse at the same time. So it was kind of like a little bit of a sort of a fun year to just do different stuff. I loved working at both places, and the scale of both places kind of helped me get kind of down on that level of, okay, this is what winemaking's like. This is what having a brand feels like. And I was kind of getting sort of myself oriented a little bit to that. Doug, of course, has great wines. So I was also, for the first time I was really exposed to Chardonnay and the basic, the kind of the magic of Chardonnay in Oregon. So that was the big takeaway from that experience. I really was, we were drinking the 01s at lunch, and I was like, wow, Oregon Chard, this is good. And his wine was really good. So that was a little bit of a aha with Chard that I hadn't had before. And so that was cool. And then after that, I worked for Archery Summit. So I took a job there, worked for Anna Matzinger. But I wanted to work in vineyards. And I also was, I don't know, I was kind of inclined toward something different than archery. It felt, maybe it was being inside that building. I was kind of used to being outside a little bit. And I was kind of like, I don't know, it was cool, but anyway, long story short, I got called by John Paul, and actually I got called by his assistant, Kyle, and he asked if I'd be interested in taking the assistant job at Cameron. And so Archery Summit lasted 6 months, and I couldn't turn that one down. I had to, I knew the vineyard part was part of it. I knew he was an iconic producer, and I'd had some kind of like natural sort of connection to John, and so I did that. And again, the wines are rustic and sensual and very Oregon. I think that was the other thing. My stopover at Archery, it felt like there was a little bit of the DNA of it was a little different than what I was used to. I like really essential Oregon feel. Like we have our own thing. And so once I got to John's, it was like I was kind of starting over again. Very very much a unique atmosphere. He makes wine in his own way. He farms too, and so all sort of like the industry standard stuff that you pick up at bigger places didn't really apply. So it was kind of like starting over and learning this other thing, and it was very European too. Like his whole sensibility was a little more old world. And that was the underground portion of my sort of training that I hadn't experienced yet, and being around wine that was in barrel in a space that was damp and cool, and just there were so many little nuances to that I hadn't understood yet, and I realized like winemaking is so. In some ways, there's some generic aspects to it that get kind of like passed along to place to place to place, and I realized like really, really interesting and cool wine is more, it's more of a sensual process. You kind of ask why, you don't just do it. You go, why do I top every week? I don't know. And truth is, you don't really have to. But if you're in if you're in an above ground facility and your your wine's shrinking because your atmosphere is dry, then topping every week is what you do need to do. So there was like all these little things that were emerging that I was like, wine is there's so many different ways to get there. And industry protocol is something you should question. In your training, you get things. A lot of places kind of do the same thing, and so Cameron was a great place for me to realize that, you don't have to, and in some ways you shouldn't. You should ask. Every little detail of the wine should be a question of why am I doing this, and so it was neat, and I think that old world sensibility kind of sank in too, and realizing that Oregon's so new, really. And if all we do is focus on our own stuff here, we're kind of missing some things. I think our evolution as a region can be benefited by a little more exposure and a little more understanding of how the old world has been operating. And so he brought that into mind too. I think, we all get a little bit carried away with our own scene. And I think as a community, we develop sort of cellar palate for Oregon. And I think we sometimes feel like we're making these strides, but it sometimes feels like it's in a vacuum too. So he was good about kind of like breaking me out of this mode of it's all about Oregon. Like the sun rises and sets on Oregon, and wine being such an old thing, we're in a continuum. We're not really, coming out of nowhere. We're lucky that we found Oregon, and Oregon's been discovered. But it's such a long. The history of wine is so long that we have to keep looking at what's come before us, and not get too caught up in what we're doing as the end all be all. So John was great for that. So there was a lot of takeaway there, and I did 6 vintages there. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, part of 8. So yeah, it was cool, and it was cool because I got to learn how to run a small business. And I think, as I said before, in a bigger winery, you get kind of buffered from market, what works, what doesn't. And so as training goes for having a winery, it was ideal. Many small wineries and many of my peers look at John's model as being pretty tip-top in terms of, you know, having great quality, interesting wines, unique wines, and a neat business that's always relevant. So I think that was another sort of take-home. There's a lot of training going on there, and the cool part is he never said like, "Hey, you know, pay attention to this. I'm gonna drop some knowledge." He never did that. It was just like kind of just being around him and seeing how he did his thing, and
So at what point did you decide that you were ready and wanted to start your own thing?
That was 2005, and I wanted to get a brand started. You know, it would be small, but he had done a little thing for Jay Summers, and he said, "Okay, there's Jay's old footprint. He had like taped it. You know, it's where the pallet, his pallet of wine, or 2 pallets, I think." He says, "You can have that space right there, and that's all." So he said, "You know, go for it." And it was generous in retrospect, because I think what Jay did was he turned that little pallet-sized footprint into, you know, his winery. And so I did the same thing. I made 4 barrels. I had come to how I wanted to make wine. At least I knew where I was going to start, and then I was able to do it there. And then the following year I made 6 barrels there, 2 Chardonnays, I think. And then after that he's kind of like, he was very wise in that regard. He said, if you're really going to have a brand, you got to focus on it. And he knew also as an assistant that if I had a brand, I'd start to be thinking more about my stuff. And he knew, because he had started a brand. So he knew, like, it takes everything, even if it's not really that big. So, so in 2007, I took the space here and started kind of ramping up. But I felt ready, and I felt like I knew what I wanted. I had connections in the industry, and so.
You mentioned when you started that you had an idea what you wanted to make, or where you wanted to go, how you wanted to make it. Tell me what your kind of initial sort of winemaking philosophy was at that point, and maybe how it's changed today, if at all.
Well, I think for me, the first thing was just purity. I really loved all the wines that I'd been around that felt earthy and pure and transparent and expressive, and I liked unique too. I liked a little signature, a brand signature. So Doug had that, John had that, Erath had that at the time. When you drank the wine, you went, "Yeah, this is a Cameron, this is a Brickhouse, this is a Erath." I love that, and I think so if you trace back to what that is, it was these wines were made so simply. They weren't over extracted. They were just delicate and pure, and so that was like the first thing. That was my biggest priority, was to make wines that felt like that. You know, it was the taste of it, it was the smell of it, but it was the feel of it. It was real. So I went into it with that goal in mind. I didn't add any, you know, I wasn't a yeast guy or an acid guy or a, you know, filter guy. It was just nothing. I really took a lot of pride in that. And that's where the wines ended up, which was cool. And I did the long aging. You know, I really appreciated overwintering, so 16 to 20 months. I like the natural refinement of that. I like the beauty of the wines, the natural clarity, the balance from that. Like, you can't simulate time, you know. You can't just filter it and call it, you know, it's different. You gotta wait. And so I was into that. I wanted to make that wine that I really loved right out of the gate. I wasn't thinking about, okay, I'll get to that wine, you know. I was like, I want to make that wine. I'm not gonna do 4 or 5 years of turning the wine over quickly just to get the, you know, the return and stuff. So I had this longer program mindset, and I thought that was the best way to get to the wines that I wanted to make. And so I was committed to that. 2 vintages in the cellar at one time. Right now it's 19 and 18, but that was how I set it up. So we didn't bottle our first wine until 2007. And I wanted the wines to feel that integrity, and I wasn't gonna compromise on that. And that's sort of what happened. I mean, I think the wines came off sort of mature, and they didn't feel, I mean, I feel like I had enough training and enough behind me that I think I wasn't kind of like fishing around, you know, for what I wanted the wines to feel like. And I think that was a good thing. I think that was a great thing about having experience. And so I felt like the wines were where I wanted them in terms of purity, and I was working with Dundee Hills Fruit, which I liked. You know, I still kind of have that in my system, you know. And so I was happy with where the wines were and stuff, and I thought the brand had an identity too, which is cool right out of the gate. But I was careful with that. You know, I wanted it to feel rustic. I did. I knew the aesthetic I was trying to project. You know, I wanted them to feel related to this ilk of producer I admired, and that was the Camerons and the Brickhouses and the Iries and the Evesham Wood. Like, I wanted to belong in that camp, you know. So I was pretty deliberate about that, and yeah, just, you know, I always think about, I remember seeing a picture of David Lett, and it was a cool picture because he was in the cellar, and he's in his like cellar gear, and he's standing over a barrel, and he was so like you could tell he was so thoughtful and so like into it. And I think, you know, his legacy probably by then was totally set. And yet there he was, still in his barrels and thinking, and, you know, I think he was always trying to improve his thing, but I always feel like it was a quest that was really personal. And it was like he was engaged in a way that was very personal too, and trying to hit a new spot but keep his core like integrity and intact. And I think that's the thing, is you know, every year you're trying to make progress, and yet you want to retain a sense of what you think is valuable, and what you're trying to be true to Pinot Noir, you know, and Chardonnay. But you're trying to be true to that in terms of you want to honor it, and with the goal in mind of improving it. You want to, you know, honor the nature piece and make sure it's all happening in a way that feels holistically good, you know. And I think, and that's a very, very like neat part of making wine, and I think there's mystique around Pinot. There's mystique around this region that grows it. There's a mystique, I think, and I kind of try and tap into that too as I'm going through this and listen. And so back to the wines, and so like from there, I was, I think, feeling pretty good about the identity of the wines. And then, of course, as you go along, it's interesting. You know, those early days are so awesome because you have all your scruples. You know, you have you're not going to bend for anything. And then naturally, I think you start to take in like what's going on out there. So I think the life cycle, and I'd probably think if I talked to a lot of my peers, they would agree that 2 or 3 years in, you start wondering, am I doing this right? Am I getting this right? Am I, you know what I mean? And you're looking around at the industry as a whole, and you're wondering, how do I fit in? And am I fitting in? And so there's like these little questions that come up. I think you get a grace period in the beginning where you just don't give a rip, and then all of a sudden you're conscious of your thing and your place. And I think also as your volumes build, you have to make sure you're relevant. So I think there's that sort of thing that happens too, is okay, now I'm building a business and now it has to be relevant. And so what's relevant and what makes up relevant? And I think somewhere in there you gotta protect the wines and protect them from all that. But as a winemaker, you're going through these stages of how am I doing?
Existentialism here.
Yeah.
Where do I fit in that?
Yeah. How am I doing? And what's and the wines are always a little bit of the wines are always in the middle of that somehow. And so you might spend a little more time dissecting the wines as you go along, and some of it's quality control, some of it's your market trends and stuff, and then some of it's just you're changing and you're learning about wine too as you go. You get 1 year to do this. Between then and the next vintage, you probably drink a lot of wine, and you probably soak in a lot of input. As a winemaker and a brand owner, you're taking in a lot of input, and so the next year you might have a whole other kind of baseline. But you have to be careful not to reinvent the wheel, and so you're always kind of evaluating what's my true north and what's working for me, and what do I feel like tweaking. And so my commitment to purity is still at the center of it. Terroir is really important to me now. I think having visited Burgundy, I'm like, wow, terroir is so important. And we get caught up in the wine and winemaking and where the wine lives. But this commitment to terroir it felt like I didn't quite understand even myself what I meant or thought about terroir. And so now I feel like the wines have to drive even more toward that goal of terroir than in the beginning. And I think the method for doing that has changed for me. I see ways that I can put a finer point on terroir in the process. And so I think just throwing the grapes in the fermenter and letting it rip, putting it in barrel, waiting, and then bottling, it was a great starting point. And I look back on all the wines they made just that way, and I love them. And then some of them I look at and I think, okay, I'll keep that, and that, but I want more of something else. And so I think it's neat, the winemaking, like having a brand and stuff is really cool, because I do think you go through the natural, like the confidence that comes with being new, like where you're just like, don't give a rip about anything. And then all of a sudden you care about everything. And then you get to actually a place where you're a little like back to the, this is I feel really confident now in what the vision is. And I think that's a neat evolution. And so the wines to me now, even though they still resonate as really pure, and the feel of them is still great. I like the transparency, and I think they're actually more refined in terms of the delivery of that. I think that, as I said, a finer point, and I think that's just going through some stages where I maybe played around with something, like I did a lot of stem for a minute, and then I felt like, okay, I'm drifting from where I wanted to be, and then at the same time I was tasting a lot of old world wine. I'm like, there's no compromise in terms of terroir in old world wines. Rarely do you taste one that feels manufactured, and yet some of these are big scale wines, and they're not always expensive either. And you're like, this is their experience paying off. They're like, okay, terroir is still the thing, but we're going to refine. We're going to make sure that the wines are getting more precise and more polished and more, just like the drinking experience is always improving. And so I think that's kind of I think that's my job, is to kind of create this balance and make sure that when you're drinking the wine, you're like, God, this is just, man, it's good. Like, it's well made and it feels good. And that doesn't mean to really trump the terroir and the sense of place and the vintage. It's just a better wine overall. And I think that's where the old world, I'm in a tasting group, and it's not super rigorous, but we drink a lot of old world wine, and you try and decode that somewhat, deconstruct it, and then apply it to your own setting. And I think that's where we are in Oregon. We're so young that we're actually having to do that. We're actually having to come up with ideas and apply them, and then see how it works out. And where we get that information is, some of it's internal, some of it's other wineries, other winemakers. But referencing the old world is a great thing too, just because of their experience.
Absolutely.
I think they've been through these steps. I think one of the cool things about Oregon is it's young in the big scheme. It's a 40-year-old, 50-year-old industry, and it's really nothing. So we take these, we get into these sort of moments where we think, okay, we've arrived at this spot, whether it be on the winemaking side or the viticulture, and we'd love it to be the end of the line, and we've found the answer, and it's, we're done. But the truth is that never happens. These are just the way, the sort of the benchmarks, and these are the things that move the industry forward, but it's never done.
Right.
And it's kind of cool to think, like 200 years or 300 years from now, like what Oregon would be like, and yeah, I'm sad actually I won't be there, but I'm just like, this is so cool, to be a part of this and see something come out of nowhere, and yet it's so young, and and so I think too, what am I in now? Vintage 12 or something of Crowley, and I think about what do I want to achieve as a brand to contribute, which I never thought of in the beginning. I was like just trying to get the brand running, and and everybody's got that sort of thing. But now I think a little bit like, okay, what does the industry need? How can my brand leave a sort of an impression in terms of progress for Oregon? So I'm thinking along those lines a little bit too, like what would make Oregon feel a little bit more like, I always think about Burgundy, but like what do we need to be doing to kind of get ourselves there? Because I think Oregon's special like that, and it will be. I think Oregon has a really great future, and I think we're a little bit of a harder one to put our finger on, and I think but that's the kind of the beauty of it. It's not easy, and I think it's not easy for consumers. It's not easy for the players in the market. It's not easy for the winemakers, but I think that's the cool part. Is I think there's density to this, and so to think of Oregon being in the distant future another Burgundy is kind of neat.
Absolutely. And
so I think we have to, but I think it's all baby steps. There's never going to be like the one big quantum leap, and that's cool too. I think we all have to kind of be process oriented, even within our own brand. We have to be process oriented. There isn't one thing that's going to make your brand done, and there isn't one thing that's going to make Oregon done. It's just a lot of little steps, and all very conscious, and that's neat because we're building something, and I think it's cool. Everybody talks about the community being close here, and I think that's why. Because I think at its core, people here, we know we're all part of this story, and I think everybody's trying to do it right too. That's the cool part. So I think that there aren't many shortcuts. I don't see a lot of shortcuts happening out there, and I think that's really cool.
So you mentioned kind of the life cycle of the winemaker, of the confidence, and then the kind of abject fear, and then the confidence again. I'm curious, in your experience, was there a moment for you or a vintage for you when you felt like I got this, like I am doing the right thing, I am a part of this community, I have a future?
I think man, it's really recent, to be totally honest. I think it's like 17, like I said, the first few, I was just sort of like, I think until I hit 11, I was pretty sure like it was all just going just great. And and I think then you hit some adversity, you get a big vintage. I grew a lot at that point. I was kind of in this aggressive, like, I always wanted to be 3,000 cases, you know, which is where we are now. That was John's number. And that was all I was thinking about. Was like, I just wanted to be as, you know, that size. That, you know, it was kind of a magic size. But I got kind of caught. I jumped a little too quickly in 11, and then it was like the perfect storm, and those wines were not well received. So I kind of took it was kind of humbling just in general, because I'd grown quickly. The vintage wasn't selling well. 2013 was tricky. So I think the industry in general kind of was dealt a little blow there. You know, there was like, all of a sudden we were in this, like, pricing was changing. The vintages weren't as well received, and I think that was across the board. And then I think success felt like it was a little bit at a premium, you know, and all of a sudden, like, we're all kind of crawling out of our own hole. And for the newer brands, you know, like us and some others, my peers, I think we hadn't been through that yet. So it was, you know, it was like all of a sudden now we're having to kind of scramble, and what it felt like came easy was not so easy. And so, and then I think in general the industry was dealing with just a little bit of a lull, and pricing was shifting, a lot of stuff was shifting. And like I said, I think success felt like it was harder to grasp, you know, and then this questions set in. And you're kind of going, okay, well, what are they doing that I'm not doing? And how do you get that score? And how do you know? And so a little bit of the calculation starts to happen. And I think that was just being totally honest, I think, you know, I got caught up in a little bit of that. Even though people probably didn't even know I was caught up in it, I was caught up in it. And I was questioning a lot of stuff. So I you know, just being totally transparent, you know, I was in here gripping. I was thinking a lot about where do I fit in? Do I have respect from my peers? You know, like there was like stuff that was creeping in that I was sort of, I didn't feel any of that until, you know, sort of a little phase there. And it was, you know, it's at 14, 15, 16, somewhere 14, 15, 16. And I, you know, I didn't lose my way really with the wines, but I was really definitely trying different stuff. I think I was maybe reworking you know, I'd say maybe the winemaking went into a little bit of not the shards, but I think the Pinots went into a more of exploratory. I was kind of borrowing from people in terms of what I thought was going on out there. And I think that I was intrigued on one level. I also wondered if that was the next thing that I should do. You know, so I got into that mode of, well, maybe this is the ticket. And so I started doing some of that in my own wines. Stem was the big one, just to be specific. And I think I told myself that I was like advancing the wines and I was advancing. But in fact, it was really it was kind of a little bit of just a detour, you know, and I was just kind of in a mode where I was trying to figure it out. And then it wasn't really until 17, and I finally got the 16 vintage behind me, and I started really sensing while we were finalizing the 16s and putting them in the bottle and stuff, kind of realized I didn't really like the wine. Like, I didn't want to drink them, you know. And I thought, this isn't really me. And so I started thinking more about, okay, I started doing more retrospective tastings of our wines, some of the verticals. So I've been tasting older stuff, and then I could see where it like moves into this phase, and then I'm like, I like those older wines, even though they were less, I'd say less drawn up. You know, there was not a blueprint really. So I kind of had a reset and got back to kind of what I thought was my aim, and that was what kind of came really to me in 17. Even as the wines were being made, I was like, I think I'm feeling this approach, and I was done with STEM, and I think just everything started to make more sense to, you know, to me, and yet I felt like I was also a little more mature in the approach, and so I'd sort of learned stuff too, and it kind of coalesced around this 17 vintage, and all of a sudden I was just really stoked and more like, I think, purposeful, I guess. And so it was cool. It's like the layering of stuff, even like the detour and sweating certain things, and that was all part of it. And I think that's probably not a really unique story, but I think, you know, having been through it myself, I understand, like, you know, you go through stages, and as a crafts person, you know, I always think of like like bands and stuff, and like they go through these like little stages.
That was exactly what I was just thinking as you were describing that.
You're like, you know, the synthetic age of the 80s, and you know, and I think took a lot of bands probably in a little bit of
17, you went back to your guitar, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I kind of went analog, you know, and no, it's you know, it's my mini journey, but I think you know, most winemakers probably stand in the room and think the same stuff. You know, how do I fit in? Am I fitting in? Am I making wines that are true to me? And you know, how do I sustain that and also improve? You know, and be open to change, and you know what I mean? So I think I always feel like, though, even with all those little sort of nuances, I feel like I've always had like kind of a little bit of a bedrock thing, an identity in the wines, and that's important. All the brands that I respect and admire, no matter what they do and whatever sort of path they take, if they have some true like brand identity, I think that's a great thing. The worst thing is to be seeking so much that your brand isn't really a brand, you know. I think that's really important. Like, I understand like phases and stuff, but I think you can tell when a wine or a brand is you know, jumping around too much. So I feel like even with all the chaos, I've kind of had a little bit of a thread that's been consistent. So that's cool.
So what are you looking for? You talked about the importance of terroir to you, but you don't have your own vineyard. So tell me what you're looking for in vineyard sites, and then how you're looking to express that in your wines. What are you seeking in fruit?
I've been through, so I've done some, I mean, I think Dundee resonated with me for the, I mean, you can't deny when you train somewhere and that's all you know, that you kind of fall for it. And I sort of did. I fell for the Dundee Hills. It wasn't hard. I mean, I loved it. I drank a lot of that. And I drank and I loved it. And so I think I soaked in that kind of wine, that red fruit, the warm spice aspect that, you know, that goes on there, the little bit of maple that I find really intriguing. I like the build of the wines, I like the color of the wines, and so Dundee worked for me. I never felt like Dundee wines would ever feel like overblown and dark. So I really like that. I like that they're ultimately pretty, and the red fruit is, you know, strawberry, bright cherry. It would never run to that brooding side. I guess I'm more attracted to feminine Pinot. I think some of the sedimentary soils drive a little too dark for me. And so, and I had worked with some sedimentary soil fruit, and sure enough, it's always denser and darker and a little. There was one vineyard I worked with, actually. It was a cool little vineyard over on Calkins Lane, and that was an exception. That was a older vineyard, own rooted, old vine, and it had a lot of interesting stuff going on. But by and large, when I drink sedimentary soil wine, I feel like it's just a little too dark for me. So I like the lighter red end of the spectrum. So 3 of the vineyards we have are Dundee. And then the 4th vineyard, the Four Winds vineyard, is also basalt, so it's volcanic, but it's rockier, so it's leaner, and it even drives more light than Dundee, which I like. So it's fruit that can't be turned into a big chunky wine. It just can't. And so I like that. I like that kind of expression, and that's come to me in the last few years too, because I just, last year I experimented with some fruit from Ribbon Ridge, and it is dense, it's dark. And I'm like, I just don't relate to this. I want to see through it. And I want it to feel airy. I like airy Pinot, airy expressive Pinot, that's a personal thing, and people have different takes on what they want in their Pinot. I want it to feel airy and available. I want to taste the finer points and not have structure in the way, and dark fruit, and I want to taste sort of the finer points. And I feel like for me that's where the volcanic soils sort of thrive. So.
And you gave us a tour before the interview started of the facility here. Tell me about how you found this space and sort of what appeals to you about working here at August Cellars.
I was convinced when I left Cameron that I wanted to go underground. Like, that was just not negotiable. Which left me with very few options, as it turns out, in terms of what I was only making half of this row worth of wine, So it was, I didn't need a whole building to myself, but I knew I'd probably be in a shared space, which I was fine with. And then, but I did want to be underground, and I just kind of heard about this place, and heard it was a beautiful facility, and it was new-ish at the time, and they were still, building out their tenants and stuff. And so I came, and I just asked Tom if they had space, and they did. They had a little bit of space, so that was just really, to me, the main objective was to no matter what my scale, that I would be able to put the wines in an environment that was beneficial to the aging I wanted to do, and like I said before, I wanted to make the wines I wanted to make. I didn't want to wait to do that. So I wasn't interested in being in an above ground, warehouse in Portland, or we got asked to do that a lot because a lot of wineries were combining efforts at that time, and we got asked numerous times if we would want to join in and get into a place in Portland or other places out in the valley. This sort of the cooperative thing was happening, and we were all younger producers getting rolling. So it was a win-win if you could do that. But a lot of those places didn't have the underground aspect, and that was really the big thing for me. Was the wine and where it's at. And, having been at Cameron for all those years, I wasn't willing to bend on that, and that's why I'm still here. Because I've never wanted to move out of here, move the wine somewhere else above ground just to have an address to ourselves. And, there's trade-offs there, obviously, and it's stuff I have to think about all the time is, not having your own winery. There's some limitations, and, and we've had to adjust to that. But for me, it's still really so much just about the wine, and we brand build in different ways. Everybody brand builds in different ways. Some people sell their address. Some people sell the fact that nobody can find you. So I feel like we're playing that card a little bit. Where the hell do they make that wine? No, it's true though. You kind of work with what you got. But it's also been good because brand building is so delicate that to not be encumbered with all the, what comes with building a winery, and it's different than it was in the 60s, let's put it that way. So it's allowed some flexibility there too, just in terms of the practical end of having a business. You got to prioritize, and we're close to Portland. We do a lot of marketing in Portland, so the warehouse is here. Some logistics stuff really works out great. But again, back to really just the wine and feeling so strongly about, I think our wines tend to over-deliver, and I know why. I think I know why. But, and that's important to me. I'm not going to give up on that. I want them to feel like they're great value, but I think this is important to that, and so I think I do, and so.
Absolutely. I know that was really awesome.
Yeah, and I would say it's probably not unique at all. But it's
not everybody's willing to share it though, so we appreciate you sharing it because not everybody is willing to talk about that kind of stuff, so we appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean the wine industry, I think there's it's something we got to be careful with too, because it's a tough business. It's a tough business, and I think developing your longevity or your formula for longevity is you're not going to get that right away. You're not going to understand what is your formula for long-term relevance and not having burnout. And I think it's a competitive industry, so I think you have to find ways to manage all that and but I think it's natural to get into spots where you're stressing and maybe overworking it, or you know what I mean. So, and it's something I talk about with fellow winemakers too. Is just you want to be careful not to have this burnout thing, and because it's all encompassing, this work. You've got hospitality, you've got production. You're all trying to make a fine wine and make your mark with this. But we all know that marketing isn't always about just this. And so there's a lot of demands that get placed on you, and you can place them on yourself, and it's just part of the navigation of the whole thing. If it were just about the wine, I think everybody would be a little more relaxed.
Yeah.
But it isn't just about that. So it's up to everybody to figure out their path, and then to come up with something sustainable. Yeah.
So you talked a lot when we started about the changes you were seeing kind of as you came into the industry and sort of the shifting industry. So tell me, as you look back now, 20 some years into being a part of the Oregon wine industry, what are the biggest changes you've seen? Obviously, in addition to just pure size of the industry now, what are the biggest changes to Oregon wine that you've seen? What is different about Oregon wine now than when you started?
The product side?
In any way you want to take it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the cool thing is I consider myself and my peer group to be like the third wave, if you want to call it that. And I think we have a strong regard for the pioneers, and that's not just sort of anecdotal. I talk to my peer group, and I think there's a healthy regard for what they went through, how they made the wines. And yet the second wave too was super relevant in terms of advancing in general quality, I would say, and coming up with new ways to go about this that are also very relevant. And so we I think tried to kind of like bring those two pieces together. And I feel like that's happening. Like I think the wines still feel sensual, but they're also well made. So I don't think they're exclusive concepts. Yeah, I mean, I think the pioneers, I mentioned David Lett earlier, but I think all of them were really passionate about terroir. And I think that's something that we just kind of have to keep, bringing with us while the advancements are made in process and quality. And so I think what I'm seeing now are lots of refined wines being made, but also with a sense of place, and they feel good. They're not being made in a way that's gimmicky or just for scores, or I think there's a lot of soul in the wines that are going on right now. But I also feel like they're mature. They feel grown up. They feel informed, and I think that's good. I think the winemakers across the board are all working hard, and I think that's neat. I think they're all. It feels like everybody's working hard at getting better, and and the community I think is still strong as ever. It's kind of cool seeing shifts in age group, and there's always still a little like trends and stuff, but I think on the whole everybody's feels like sort of more or less on the same page. And there's always little like sort of subgroups and factions and whatever, but when it comes right down to it, everybody still really kind of loves each other. And I don't think there's like this thing where we judge one another for our methods. I think that's cool. It's like, okay, that works for you, it doesn't work for me, and it's fine.
What do you see as you look ahead for the industry? Say, you mentioned 200 to 300 years earlier, but even just say 10 years in the future, what do you see for Oregon wine?
I think there's going to be probably even more old world influence on process. I think there's a lot of like cross-referencing with Burgundy, and I think some of that's migrating into Oregon, and I think winemakers are kind of feeling like, okay, that's the next place, and we need to learn more about that and import some of that to our own processes, and I think that's cool. I think, funnily enough, I think packaging is gonna have some sort of advances. Like, I think of like just like some of the graphic aspects of our branding is I think kind of on the move a little bit. I think we're going to be able to take some more risks there, which will make, I think it'll kind of make it'll probably make the identity a little bolder, and maybe slightly more sophisticated. That's a nuance. That's like kind of really nuanced, but I think it's happening. I think there's I mean, if you look at the old world, just like graphically, their packaging is very, very kind of smart, and it seems like they've got professionals working on this stuff, whereas we've always kind of done it a little bit either on the cheap or on the fly or a little bit of both, and I think once that kind of genie's out of the bottle, I think the industry has to respond and evolve, and I think that's a cool thing. We're working on our own sort of updates too, and I think that's good, because I think it will push the industry as a whole into being even more relevant. So I think this awareness of we're competing on a world stage, and so we have to keep up. I can think of like upstate New York, where I fell for wine. I hate to say it, but their labels just suck, and it's sad, because I think in order to get taken seriously, even if the wine is there, you got to have some awareness of like, okay, what's that about? And I think we're being put to the test a little bit there, and so I think there's that. And I think within the wines, I like where everything's going. I do think the wines feel like they're sharper, and I think there's a better. It's funny, it's ironic, because the natural wine industry like stripped wine down to its bare essentials. Like, we do nothing, and it kind of like was this thing that was kind of rubbing up against the classic wine producers as like, that's totally bull crap, because they're not doing anything. They don't know how to make wine. And I think, but here's the thing is, the positive takeaway from that is that natural wine became engaging. People got engaged with it. They go, I'm going to drink that. I don't care what's going on. It's interesting. It's different. It's engaging. And I think I kind of define it as classic wine producer, and like Oregon in general, this refined product that was kind of making advances and supposedly getting better wasn't always getting better. I think you could say that it was probably cleaner, it was more stable, it was proper, like you wouldn't be able to like pick it apart. But was it better? And I think we kind of plateaued a little bit there. And I think the natural wine industry, everybody's got an opinion about it. But I think the take home for me was it actually kind of got everybody thinking about, is your wine engaging? Is it better? Is it good? I mean, is it really good? And not just sort of checking the box is good. And I think we don't all have to go to that. We don't have to go back to the the basics. I admire natural wine for the purity and the whole thing is so nature driven. I get it, but I think we can apply some of the same aspects to classic wine making. Like, we have to make these wines engaging and keep them engaging. Like, we can't just sort of rest on our laurels and think, okay, it's solid, it got a 92 or a 93, we're good. I think we have to constantly address, are these wines really good, like really good, or are we just trying to sell them as good? And I think that's a next level place, and I think people who are really passionate about wine know the difference. I think they know when you're just sort of phoning it in. And I think the Oregon wine industry was the beneficiary of a lot of, a good enough amount of hype that I think it was easy to kind of be like, we got this. And I think what I sense right now is that a lot of producers are like, you know what? No, we can do better. And I think it's our duty to keep even without like presenting flaws and weirdness, we still have to present something that's engaging, and so I think that's harder than it sounds, truthfully.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think we have to be our own critics and make sure we're doing that. And so I think winemaking in Oregon is pretty ambitious, truthfully. I think people are really quick to be like, at least right now, I think people are in this mode of like, we want to be at the top of the mountain, and not even so much like in the marketing sense, but I think the winemaking sense, which is kind of cool. It's like there's just like this really serious attempt to like really make great wine. And I think that's neat. I see it really profoundly in the Chardonnay department, but I also think Pinot too. I think people are really getting really, really down deep into this, like, what is great wine? And so that's neat to be a part of. Truthfully, it keeps you going. It does. Yeah.
On that note, what about you as you look ahead for your own future, for yourself, for Crowley? What do you see coming down the road for yourself?
I think I want to own Vineyard. I think that's my sort of big. I'm kind of sort of content with barrels being here or maybe somewhere else, but I kind of feel like. Just for me personally, I would feel good if we owned at least part of our inventory in a vineyard. I mean, things change, and we're along far enough that I've got things that are important to the brand. But we can do long-term contracts too. I think that's just something we all have to think about. Is like, okay, now how do we build longevity and some security with our sources and stuff like that. Equity building, I mean, virtual winery is I mean, I don't think this is insignificant, but as a business goes, I have ideas as to how I'd like to proceed. Maybe a little bit of growth, 4,000 cases, somewhere in there would be a nice spot. Some tweaks to the branding in terms of, I think I want to diversify a little bit in the Chardonnay department. Yeah, and I mean, I guess constantly, I feel pretty content right now, but I also know that, every vintage is different and new, and so, there's never really a spot where you relax. I think I'm, getting a little older, so I guess I'm feeling like, I want to make sure that there's, maybe some things like vacations and stuff that are, built in, that kind of stuff. Nothing crazy. I mean, I like my work, but I think, sustaining it and keeping it healthy and is cool. I've been delegating more, which is nice. So I'm kind of able to think more sort of big picture. So I think that's healthy, and nothing too crazy. I think security long term for the vineyards is probably the big one. We've done a lot of work in the Four Winds Vineyard. It's more or less a monopole, but there's some amazing Chardonnay from there that's really, I wouldn't be able to duplicate that. So it's important to secure sourcing.
So as you look back on your time in Oregon wine, what are you proudest of?
Probably just the amount of time I put in with other producers. I think in the landscape and in terms of like getting to that ultimate place of making great wine, I think that's imperative. That context, the learning of the terroir, the learning of the sort of the Oregon story, and putting in time with other producers, and not having a brand at that time, which made it so that I was really just it was a job, of course, but I was there for them, and I took all that in, and I think as I look back, I think, man, 25 vintages, like, it feels like a lot right now. I mean, it does, and I'm proud of that. I don't feel old. I feel like I'm, still kind of getting started, but then I'm like, 25 vintages. That's pretty cool. So I'm kind of sort of quietly proud of that, because I think it does actually play out. And definitely feel like, making the most of my professional life so far. And I was lucky to be in the position I was in. And I feel like all the mentoring and, really crossing paths with the right people, all the way through, I feel like I've been in a good company, and having like great people to look up to and learn from, and so yeah, it's been great, but it's a lot of years now. It's sort of funny. I mean, sometimes it went fast, but then I'm like, geez, that's a lot, So I won't say that anymore. So.
Well, thank you. That's all the questions that I have for you. Is there anything we didn't cover that we should have covered? Anything I didn't ask that I should have asked?
Not really. I think, I kind of feel like the way it went was kind of perfect.
That's all I want to hear then.
I mean, it's funny when I talk about that. I've never talked about that little lull, so I think that's pretty interesting, because I do think most Oregon stories probably have some moment of call it a setback or adversity or whatever, and I think that's if I'm really being honest, that is part of my story too, and not like it was totally profound, but I think it's enough to where I think what it reminds me of is that probably everybody gets in a moment of questioning and wondering where they fit in, and it's kind of helps probably make you a little better long term, because in the beginning, it felt like things were falling into place. Like this kind of after I worked with Cameron, his reputation is so good that it opened a lot of doors for me, and so but at some point you're kind of on your own, and you got to figure it out. So.
Well, we appreciate you sharing that, especially, and everything else, all the stories and memories. So, thank you so much, and we'll let you out of here.
Thanks for